Not much discussion, though, about divorce. Dueling. The California State Constitution of 1849, very important year, reads in the 11th chapter, section 2. Any citizen of this state who shall, after the adoption of this Constitution, fight a duel with deadly weapons, or send or accept a challenge to fight a duel with deadly weapons, either within this state or out of it, or who shall act as second or knowingly aid or assist in any manner those thus offending, shall not be allowed to hold any office of profit or enjoy the right of suffrage under this Constitution. The Church's prescription of the duel is very ancient, going back to the First Lateran Council in 1170. I'm speaking here of canon law, not of the natural law or of the gospel or anything. I'm just saying the strictly ecclesiastical aspect of the thing. And this prescription continued all the way to the letter Pastoralis Officii of Leo XIII in 1891, a letter which was addressed appropriately to the bishops of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, where the practice was still in vogue. We'll have a little more to say about that later. And it was included also in the first Code of Canon Law in 1917, in which those who participated in a duel in any way whatsoever were excommunicated and deprived of ecclesiastical burial. Now, the 1982 Code, the one which currently exists, does not have this provision anymore. So, just to give joy to Tom Fleming and certain others, at least we can say now there are no ecclesiastical penalties for dueling. The Oriental Code has excommunication for any homicide. The Latin Code, however, more in line with this Texan mentality, I suppose, or Latin in the broader sense than the language, simply says that someone who commits a homicide used to pena penatur, or oneratur, to be punished with a just penalty. But there's no excommunication except for abortion. But in any case, who knows what was in their minds when they removed that. I'm sure it was more a cultural judgment. They figured it didn't really pertain to anyone anymore. But we'll see how recently it did pertain in terms of the decrees of the Holy See in just a minute. The duelists, their seconds, spectators, advisors, attending physicians, and clergy. The priest could be standing by to absolve you. That wasn't allowed either. And if the priest did that with the knowledge of the duelers, he also was excommunicated. The priest was allowed to hide nearby, unbeknownst to the duelists, and then run out and help them. But he could not be there by a design known to those who were the duel, because they had to be aware, or at least have the salutary fear, that they would not have a priest to absolve them at the moment of death if they engaged in this activity. So that's a pretty serious condition, you know. So and it kept the priests away too, I'm sure, right? Not to the threat of excommunication. The duelists were to suffer the infamia juris, that's legal infamy, which has a lot to do with what sort of offices you can hold and privileges you can receive in the church, and the denial of church burial, as I mentioned, and before the 19th century, the confiscation of their goods, a good old-fashioned Roman way to deal with someone. The morality of the duel is evaluated in tradition by two principles, now neither of which is either what is sometimes said, an offense against the virtue of religion, going back to the idea that the duel is originally a kind of ordeal, attempt to obtain the judgment of God over a case. There's nothing in any ecclesiastical law that relates the duel to that particular question of the ordeal. It's interesting, but only to the question of human life and legitimate self-defense. Nor are there any references in church law to anything from the Sermon on the Mount. That is, an obligation or the counsel to turn the other cheek. It's not mentioned in laws prohibiting dueling, ever. It's significant. That is, the right of self-defense is taken for granted. And it's never the evangelical counsel of ceding your just self-defense for your own sake is not ever mentioned, which is intriguing in and of itself. But it shows too how the church doesn't try to prove too much when attempting to moderate people's moral choices. Until recently, that's what I would be pointing out. The morality of the duel is evaluated in tradition by two principles. The first of which is the moramen inculpate tutelae, or, in English, the standard of guiltless self-defense, meaning that one is justified in using lethal means to defend one's life against an unjust aggressor. But the duel, which takes place by agreement, that's ex convicto, does not satisfy this criterion, because at the time the lethal force is to be taken, the aggressor's action has been agreed upon by the offended party. And so he's not then and there an actual aggressor. The second principle is that of the media apta, or apt means for repairing an injustice. And the loss of honor or reputation, which is ordinarily the reason for a duel, cannot be repaired by lethal combat, but must be repaired by other legal means. The outcome of the combat itself cannot determine the injustice of the offense. In fact, sometimes the person who's unjust is the one who comes out in the duel. And the innocent party who has been offended has suffered the loss of his life, so has suffered another injustice as well. Consequently, the duel is an unjust exposure of one's own life, an intentional homicide of one who is not, at the moment of the duel, a true unjust aggressor, but rather an accomplice in a crime. Very different would be the case of one who is set upon by an opponent who says, "Take this saber or pistol and defend yourself like a man, for I'm going to kill you now." In this case, one would be justified in taking the offered weapon and defending oneself. But in the case of the duel, the whole matter is agreed upon beforehand, and so lacks the mark of a true unjust aggression. Thus far, the ecclesiastical argument, the classical one. Now let's see what the Archbishop has to say about this. We deprecate still more the unparalleled disaster of a duel, which no Christian or rational mind can countenance. Let us be allowed, while even the most ruinous errors claim to be heard, let us be permitted unhesitatingly to denounce the deadly contest, by which men laying claim to Christianity and refined manners, but acting as red men of the forest, whose mental eye has never yet seen the least glimpse of civilization, divest themselves of all sense of duties which they may owe to kindred or to society, and sacrifice perhaps forever the honor and welfare of parents, wife, or children, while they place themselves in the most imminent danger of sending their soul into endless misery. Deaf to every friendly advice and thirsting after human blood, they go like beasts into the field to decide by brute force or impious chance who is right and who is wrong. We pity the poor Indians, whose want of mental culture leads them to determine right from wrong with the bow and arrow. But what can exculpate the man who boasts of his civilization and intellectual refinement, yet has not the strength of mind to discern that powder is not the standard of right? Hence the Church of Christ, ever anxious to correct all errors and avert all evils, has frequently pronounced her anathemas against duels, and so on. Notice the almost complete absence of the traditional argument, which is replaced by an argument from urbanity as opposed to barbarous tribal manners. Note also that the bishop deplores the duel even more than divorce. Here we are confronted with an instructive example of what becomes progressively more common as a justification for Christian morality: the superior culture of modern men contrasted with the savage, an argument for moral progress rather than a rational judgment of the injustice endured and the means legitimate to overcome it. This is a rhetorical argument, an appeal to the emotions, but not a presentation of the principles of natural law. Family feeling, far from being violated by the duel, is precisely what justifies the duel in the mind of the duelists. A sense of identity and manly dignity, which must be defended as a possession more valuable than life, just as a woman may kill a man seeking to violate her, even though such a violation would not take her life, but only her dignity.